This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is June 21st, 2024. I'm Marianne Azevedo, and joining me is senior TC reporter Haya Camps. Haya, how's it going?
You know what? I'm doing great. It's a summer solstice, and I feel an incantation or two coming on. And, maybe I have to go dance naked on a beach somewhere. It seems like that kind of day.
Well, let us know if that happens. Hey, we're also joined by TechCrunch senior reporter and editor Kirsten Korosek. Kirsten, how's it going in your world? And welcome back, by the way. We missed you.
Yeah, I've been all over the place. And I just want to make a note. Haya, today is, I think it's an unofficial, I don't think it's actually a true national holiday, but it is Hike Naked Day. So instead of going to the beach, maybe hit the trail instead.
One way or the other, I'm not going to be wearing any clothes, is what I'm hearing.
Have fun with that.
Hopefully my kids aren't listening to this episode. No.
Fair. I've been gone for a bit, but I've been vacationing and also going to some cool press events, including Rivian. So I've been a bit all over, but of course I've been listening to the Equity podcast during my travels.
Well, we're happy to have you back. And as always, we live vicariously through you and your travels. So anyway, we've got a packed episode this week. A lot of different things going on. Our deals of the week are looking at Wabi, Ginger, and Safe Superintelligence. Then we're going to take a look at 2024 bankruptcy so far. We've got a number of those to dissect. And then we'll also look at Voodoo's plans for social media startup BeReal. That to me was super interesting. So anyway, first, Kirsten, Wabi raised a $200 million Series B round. Crazy. This is an autonomous trucking startup. Tell us more.
Yeah, Wabi's really interesting. So it was founded by a woman named Raquel Erdison. She's actually been on our stage in the past at a previous robotics events, really kind of considered one of the leading AI scientists and had previously been the chief AI scientist out of Uber's Toronto office prior to launching this company in about 2021. And the timing of that launch is the most probably interesting piece because at that point, AVs had sort of peaked and a lot of them were actually starting to fail and this consolidation was starting to happen. Acquisitions were happening. And she went out and ended up getting backing by actually Uber at the time and has since been making progress all around this idea of an AI first approach. So before Gen AI had become a very hypey, buzzy thing, she was actually kind of thinking about this and working on this. And so really what this round Series B is a culmination of the success she's had over the last 3 years or so, raising that 200 million Series B. She did not share the valuation, so it's hard to gauge how the pre-post valuation is, but it seems like she's still getting a lot of backing from returning investors and some new folks as well.
So yeah, a lot of money. And clearly, even though there's been some ups and downs in this space, Wabi's not the only company that's raised a rather large round this year, right? In this space.
Yeah. And that's to me, one of the more interesting things that we could probably spend a whole show on. There was this hype cycle. We went through this peak and then this fall and a lot of failures and consolidation. And then late, let's say fall of last year, we started to see some deals. And really the last month or so, we've seen a number of companies raising money in what has been a difficult funding environment. So Motional comes to mind, getting support from their existing backer, Hyundai, GM injecting another $850 million into Cruise, which is much needed cash, Wave getting $1 billion. This has all happened in the past quarter or so. And so Wabi is also, I guess, taking advantage of this better funding environment. But I think the other thing that's important to note here is that Wabi has some tech that investors are particularly interested in with this AI first approach to autonomous vehicles.
So I have a curiosity. You mentioned that this is like driverless trucks using generative AI. How's that different from the other kind of self-driving approaches we've been seeing? What is the generative piece of this? How's it different?
So when autonomous vehicles sort of the basic general premise is that it uses hardware and software combined to create the self-driving system. In the early days, it was a lot of rules-based programming combined with machine learning.
So kind of if pedestrian, then brake hard kind of thing.
Right. So there were some rules around it. Then there was this push, and Tesla has certainly has used this terminology a lot, which was the end-to-end neural networks. And that has been sort of the course and shift that a lot of other companies have been using now with, I would say, more success than Tesla, which is still only has an ADAS system, to be clear. So companies like Waymo, Cruise, using a combination of end-to-end neural networks and machine learning with some rules in place there. So it's not like the quote unquote black box. Wabi, what they're trying to do is using generative AI and neural networks to go more towards that approach. So less rules-based. And her premise is that when you can do that, it uses less computation and requires actually less data if you can be successful in this approach, as opposed to having, hundreds, if not thousands of vehicles on the streets collecting data in order to support these models. So it is something that people have been talking about for a long time. She's trying to prove it out.
I think one of the things that had me, I don't want to say I'm skeptical, but just a little bit dubious, where she says that the Wabi driver, as they call it, has this remarkable ability to generalize. So rather than trying to train the system on every single possible data point that has ever or could ever exist, the system can learn from a few examples and handle the unknown in a safe manner. Well, that kind of put up some red flags for me. I mean, from a few examples.
Yeah, I guess we have to qualify. We have to qualify what does a few examples mean to Raquel. Is that 1,000, or in her world, it could be more than a few. But I do think this is the conversation that's been happening actually in the AV world, which is the whole edge case situation. A lot of companies have been building out these simulations in order to run through all the various edge cases. And that's why there's been this movement towards more, I'm going to use this term, the industry doesn't necessarily, but sort of learning through behavior and more generalized, because what I think a lot of companies have found is it's impossible to think of every single possible edge case that could happen. So what is the better approach? Is it to have a system that can handle edge cases, even if they've never encountered that in simulation, for instance, or a system that has gone through every single edge case and therefore can handle it? And a lot of folks will argue, well, you can never possibly think of every single possible scenario. So you should have a system that's more general.
That's super interesting. And actually, this is a good segue into our next deal of the week. OpenAI's co-founder, Ilya Sutskever, announced his new company this week, Safe Superintelligence. Not shocking. I mean, he actually only left OpenAI about a month ago. And I'm not surprised he started a new company. I am surprised it happened so quickly. Haya, tell us more about it.
Well, I think this is super fascinating, right? Sutskever was the co-founder of OpenAI, right? And he was also the chief scientist. He left briefly a while ago and then came back, and there was a few back and forth and that kind of thing. But, clearly he left a month ago and already had this in the works. And he's building up this new company called Safe Superintelligence with some really high profile co-founder. I'll get back to that in just a moment. But what they're trying to do is to kind of build a super intelligence, is what they're calling it. And reading between the lines, it seems like they're actively trying to build a general AI, which is kind of the gold standard for AIs that can be used for anything. But they're saying they're prioritizing safety. And some of the critics in this space are like, look, per definition, a general AI cannot be safe because you get very, very close to self-awareness. And at that point, self-aware beings have a tendency to try and protect themselves, right? A lot of science fiction covers this in great detail. But it's fascinating because he brought in some super interesting co-founders, and he's definitely one of the sharpest minds in AI. So if he says this is possible, the world's going to pay attention.
I have a couple of questions about safety, but I will say this. I was not surprised at all, by the way, Marianne, that it happened within a month. My guess is that folks like him are constantly thinking of various ideas and maybe saw things happening in a direction that he wasn't really excited about over at OpenAI and had something pretty ready to go. And with his pedigree and experience, I'm sure he had zero trouble raising funds. But my question for Haya is, what does he mean by safe? has he talked about that? Because what I found in covering AV companies and covering Tesla is that everyone has a little bit of a different definition of what is safe. And there's been some questions with OpenAI about how will they protect and make things safe. So what is he actually doing that is different?
That is the undisclosed value question. They haven't said anything about the valuation or how much money they've raised. And they've been really vague about what this safety thing actually means. A quote in the article says that we approach safety and capabilities in tandem as technical problems to be solved through revolutionary engineering and scientific breakthroughs. We plan to advance capabilities as fast as possible while making sure our safety always remains ahead. Which is a whole lot of nothing burger, to be honest, right? There's no specifics, doesn't say anything about what safe actually means. And I think, honestly, from what I'm hearing through the grapevine is that there was just a bunch of people who got very unhappy with OpenAI in general. You know, there was the lawsuit from Musk. There was the, are we or aren't we open source? Are we owned by Microsoft? Like, there's a whole bunch of messiness that came up. And I think OpenAI in many ways became the victim of just growing so extraordinarily fast. And so I think they were just hanging on for dear life and did a medium good job with that. And it seems like Sutskever at some point was just like, look, this has gotten too political. I want to start something else where we can actually go back to basics. This is all secondary information, but that seems to kind of track with the type of company he's trying to start here.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see how this all plays out. I mean, it's pretty fascinating to watch. It's always really interesting to me when you see a company as large as OpenAI have senior people leave and then branch out, like one of the other former execs is now at Anthropic. So, you know, it's kind of interesting because it seems like if they could keep harmony within, where would OpenAI be now? Like if these people didn't leave to go do other things, it kind of makes me wonder. But anyway, we're going to switch gears a little bit. My deal of the week does involve AI a little bit. My goodness, what doesn't involve AI anymore? But it's a fintech company called Ginger, and they just raised $20 million led by PayPal Ventures. And so I thought this company was interesting because what they do is essentially offer companies, mostly startups at this point, the ability to pay for technology purchases such as software, infrastructure, cloud, with a buy now, pay later method. So, you know, it's not a new concept. There are other companies doing similar things. But what is interesting about what Ginger is doing is that they work both with buyers and sellers. So they actually work with vendors to embed technology into their platform. So when trying to sell to companies, they can say, hey, here's some flexible payment terms for you. You can pick and pay in this amount of time or over, you know, this period. Meanwhile, the companies get a way to kind of preserve their cash, right? And not burn as much and extend their runway is what the advantage is what Ginger's saying. So I hadn't really heard of anyone doing that specifically, working both with buyers and sellers. So it caught my attention. Kirsten, what do you think?
Well, the integration piece to me was the one, not saving grace here, but we've heard of this sort of idea a lot, but that piece is interesting to me. And I think it's worth mentioning that these aren't small vendors either, right? This is AWS, Okta, Cisco, Salesforce are some examples, I believe.
Snowflake, right? Yeah, exactly. Really, really large companies.
Yeah. So that to me is where it has a stickiness factor, where if you are a startup and you have all these potential platforms that you may be dealing with, and which is oftentimes a huge suck of beyond payroll, a huge amount of where your cash might be going or capital might be going, and it's integrated right there, you're likely going to then use that option. And so that stickiness factor of Ginger already being in the loop and not having to do a lot of external sales in order to get people on board, to me is the clutch part here.
Mm-hmm. Right. And they only launched about a year ago or in the second quarter of last year. So they're saying growth is 700% year over year. Of course, it was a small base because they only launched last year, but it's still, I do see that potential. PayPal Ventures did too. The new backer, existing investors also participated, including Google's AI focused fund, Gradient Ventures. So they also had raised, I think it was in December of 2022, which, a year and a half between rounds now is, dare I say, a little bit close together in this funding environment, because they used to happen sometimes within months of each other. And now it feels like companies are going longer in between rounds. But yeah, they raised more money They want to grow. And yeah, it just stood out to me. It's definitely a little bit more of a unique model. Another statistic that surprised me too, that a recent Forrester research report estimated that global tech spend is expected to reach $4.7 trillion in 2024. So, okay, think about the massive market, right? That this is a massive market. So I think Ginger's ability to grow is huge if they can do this right. Hi, I'm curious. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've just been sitting here thinking about it. In a way, they're kind of picking a fight with both the VC industry and kind of venture debt. And so it becomes another way for people to acquire these types of technologies. It's a really fascinating play. And honestly, I can't really make heads or tails of it. I was just frantically Googling and reading up on their customers.
Yeah, I mean, they make their money, like a lot of the buy now, pay later business model type companies by charging interest on their loans. They also make money from the buyers on the loan origination fees, as well as through interchange fees that they have through a card program. So they've got a diverse revenue stream. So it looks like they're not just putting all their eggs in one basket. Sorry, I hate to use cliches like that. Slapping my wrist here, listeners.
You're allowed one cliche a show. It's okay.
Yeah. But so, I mean, I think what they're doing is similar. Like when they first came out, they kind of likened themselves to startups like Pipe and CapChase, which offered like upfront cash for like predictable recurring revenue that was to come later. They said that their models sort of evolved since then, and that they said that there are other companies that kind of do what they're doing, like Tropic, Zip, and Vendor. And then there's Brex and Ramp that offer the corporate expense cards. But interestingly, when they talked about their main competitor, they mentioned Bill.com.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me too. My curiosity here is credit cards exist, other credit lines exist, invoice financing, which is, I guess, where they're kind of getting close to Bill.com, exists. I wonder which customers they end up with and whether they actually end up with the high risk kind of lowest end of the business customers, which is a strange space to be in, right? Yes, I can totally see why those business customers need this service, but I'm also imagining that's actually a pretty high risk debt category to service. So yeah. I'm really curious how that plays out for them.
Yeah, me too. I thought about that too.
Also, I guess I hadn't thought about this until just now when I mentioned it. But then how do they claw back if they are lending, and most of their customer base are riskier businesses, which have greater probability of failing? What happens when those companies fail? And how do they claw back that money? So you wouldn't want your business model to just go towards that customer group. You would hope that it would be a diverse group.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great points. They claim that as the company is maturing, it's seeing its customer base grow from early stage startups to more mature companies, spanning from Series A to pre-IPO. But yeah, I think especially with, the way things are going for companies these days and more shutdowns, that is an interesting point, and will be interesting to follow back up with them later, see how things are going. But anyway, now we are going to take a break. After this break, we're going to look at, speaking of shutdowns, a number of recent bankruptcies. Feels like there's been more than usual, but anyway, we'll be back. What's next in tech? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, where an entrepreneurial ecosystem pulses with connectivity, capability, and possibility, where the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. fast-track success, and hard work is rewarded with sunsets and turquoise waters. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. investpr.org/TechCrunch. Okay, yes. So we're going to take a closer look at recent bankruptcies. EV startup Fisker filed for bankruptcy this week in an unsurprising move. Kirsten, again, this is definitely your wheelhouse, no pun intended. We aren't shocked. What do you think about this bankruptcy filing?
Yeah, I mean, this filing should surprise no one. Mm-hmm. And, our senior reporter here, Sean O'Kane, has done a ton of deep reporting about Fisker for the last several months. And actually, prior to even coming to TechCrunch, he's been following this company for years now. And I thought his piece, which I'll get to in a moment, really encapsulated what happened here. But the nuts and bolts are this. The company filed for bankruptcy, and their estimated assets of around 500 to 1 billion liabilities of between 100 million and 500 million. And they have hundreds of creditors, including, by the way, back to bills to technology companies and services that you might have to buy. SAP, Adobe, Salesforce are among the largest. So these are companies that they owe, hundreds of thousands of dollars to because they were using their software. We've seen this coming for a while and beyond the filing, and there's going to be a lot more reporting to come on this. The vehicles themselves on the outset looked compelling and interesting. But as Sean wrote this week, it really was that they never got past that piece, meaning they were using a contract manufacturer, Magna. So they were like, great, we're going to be an asset-light company. We're handing off the hard stuff, the manufacturing, those expensive factories to an established company. But they sort of forgot all the other stuff that is necessary in order to run a car company.
Yeah, like important stuff.
Yeah. Having proper customer service, being able to handle servicing the vehicles when they inevitably will have problems, even collecting and keeping track of their own customer payments. We had a story earlier this year about how they had actually misplaced and later found about $16 million worth of customer payments. So
oops.
This is, yeah, oops. So this is a company that it wasn't that the idea was bad. It was that they did not operate it as a company. And the sort of pitiful part is that the co-founder, Henrik Fisker, has gone through this before with another company many years ago. And so the expectation was you'll learn your lesson. I mean, failure is a part of learning. You'll learn from this past failure. And it seems like you got caught up in sort of the same thing again.
Oh, yeah. And then some, really. And then some.
Yeah. And then some. It's a tough environment for EV startups as well. Even if they had executed everything perfectly, I think they still were facing a lot of headwinds. We've seen a number of EV startups fail, over a couple dozen actually over the last couple of years. Many of these companies went public via SPAC mergers and were part of that summer of meme stock saturation and fun. And really, they were pre-revenue, most of them, and they've since collapsed. And really, in the last couple of months, we've seen some other bankruptcies happen, Arrival being one of them, a battery startup called Embry, another one. So it's not that Fisker didn't do everything right in this terrible environment, and here they are. It was a combination of bad environment, bad choices.
Yeah, I think that sounds a lot like Synapse, although as this story continues to unfold, it starts to get a little more disturbing in terms of what was going on behind the scenes. Synapse was a banking as a service startup, basically, that operated the service that allowed others, mainly fintechs, to embed banking services into their offerings. We started seeing signs of trouble last year when they had some layoffs. And then finally in April, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They were going to sell their assets in this fire sale, $9.7 million only fire sale, to another fintech. That fell through. And then the company had to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Since then, it's been kind of a disaster, really. A number of the fintechs they worked with have found themselves stuck, unable to access funds that customers are wanting or needing. Copper, I wrote about, basically had to discontinue its bank operations. And overall, apparently, there's about $85 million in customer funds that are not accounted for, which is a lot of money. And I tell you, this is worrisome because there is this question of why work with an intermediary like Synapse if you can work directly with a bank. And now, after all this has happened, I think a lot more companies are going to be less likely to want to work with an intermediary like Synapse, because this has just all been kind of horrific. And in the past week, the CEO of Synapse reportedly raised $10 million for a new robotics startup while all this was still unfolding at Synapse. So yeah, anyway, this is just a mess.
It's an epic mess. And at the same time, I think if we zoom out and look at the problem that Synapse is solving, right? It is setting up a banking anything is excruciatingly difficult. And if you want to do anything in this space, you have to kind of rely on other suppliers. The thing Synapse got so incredibly right was it was all API forward. It was easy to use as a kind of banking service, right? This is the same reason why Twilio became successful, because actually sticking racks in servers to send text messages is such a massive pain in the butt. And so I think, yes, people are going to be more curious about using services like Synapse, and maybe there will be better diligence happening, and maybe these types of problems will go away. But at the same time, there's definitely a space in the ecosystem for companies like Synapse. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, I am so curious who's going to be filling this void, because it is a void that needs filling for sure.
Well, I have a question about that. So was this a case of, it sounds like, good product and poor choices, or what is the cause of this? Like in the Fisker case, yeah, economic conditions are bad, but as I noted, they made a lot of bad choices. And it seems like this is also a little bit of a dumpster fire. But what exactly did they do wrong that led them to this end, this terrible end? Yeah. Because as Haya mentioned, they had like an easy to use product.
Yeah, I think all of that's still trying to be determined. There are allegations that the CEO really just didn't understand well enough, the banking world. And actually just last week, the Federal Reserve ordered Evolve Bancorp, which was a partner to Synapse and had partnered with other fintechs to, quote, bolster its risk management programs around fintech partnerships. So now there's a lot of eyes looking at Evolve too. Like, was there enough compliance going here? There's just a lot of questions as to exactly what went wrong. There's been a lot of finger pointing since day one between, Synapse and Evolve and then the startups it worked with. So I think all of that is still coming out, Kirsten. We don't really know for sure what happened, but I do think it's kind of crazy that this guy is already raising money for another company. It just speaks of hubris. And yeah, he was responding to our request for comments pretty early on, but once the acquisition fell through and things really started to come out, he got quiet, which, sometimes silence speaks louder than words.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest question for me is like, how do you lose $85 million? It's kind of the same question as with Fisker. How do you, did you check between the sofa cushions? What the hell happened? And that just reeks of fiduciary irresponsibility. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little surprising. I mean, you don't go and raise $10 million randomly, right? That would have been in the works for a while. And what that says to me is that it sounds like the CEO kind of checked out already. And,
yeah, possibly
if it's circling the drain, of course, you're going to look at what you're going to do next. Is it a little hubrisy and is it a little bit rude? Absolutely.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
It's curious.
It is curious. Well, I know we could probably spend a whole another episode talking about this, but we're going to move on to a little bit more, I think, fun conversation here. So BeReal, a social media startup, was acquired by Voodoo for about $537 million. So this was super interesting to me. I'll be honest, never used BeReal, but basically for those who don't know, this is a startup that gives users like 2 minutes to, quote, be real by taking both a front-facing photo and a selfie. It was struggling, right? I think they were going to be running out of cash in a few months. This is not a typical acquisition where, a company's doing pretty well and they get acquired, for $500 million. But obviously Voodoo, this French mobile game and app unicorn, saw a lot of value in what BeReal can still do and scoop them up. So I don't know, this was intriguing. I think BeReal supposedly has currently about 40 million active users. People are apparently drawn to it, encouraging more authenticity, unlike some of the other social media apps. But still, $537 million for this just seemed like a lot. What do you think, Kirsten?
Yeah, I guess it was slightly lower than their last valuation of 587. I've always been interested in this company because it was super buzzy for a while, and luckily I'm not, in the predicting business too much and more in the reporting business, but it seemed like one of those things that was just going to fizzle out. Like people were going to get really excited about it. Mm-hmm. And then it was just going to fade away. And maybe it would have had it not been scooped up. For me, the value of a company like this is then how far you can take it. How far can you take the platform beyond just being real for 2 minutes? How does it evolve? And it wasn't really clear to me how it was evolving. I don't know if you have any insight into that, but to me, the big question is, what technology do they have, aside from the users, that Voodoo found so interesting that they were compelled to spend $500 million on it?
Yeah, I don't know, but from what I gather, the Voodoo CEO plans to incorporate ads into BeReal's user feed. So I think that he sees this potential to monetize through advertising, which a number of other, obviously, social media platforms have done successfully for some, not so much for others, because it feels like a little counter to what the company is touting, right? Authenticity, be real. But hey, here's an ad so you can, maybe look a lot prettier if you do this, right? So it feels a little contradictory in a way, but it's a big bet, right? A half a $1 billion bet. And that ad strategy, I think, is what we're curious to see, will it actually work out for them?
Yeah, I think there's two little things too that I want to kind of pick at. One is, we don't write about these kind of acquisitions a lot, but they happen a lot, like a soft landing or an acqui-hire or that kind of thing. This is like the last ditch, like it's this or failure, right? So these kind of exits happen a lot of the time. It's hard to get numbers on it because it usually doesn't get reported. But if you're in the VC space often enough, you see them a lot. The other thing worth keeping in mind is, right, they spend 500 million euros, so about $540 million on 40 million active users. So that's a customer acquisition cost of $13. Now, in a lot of these kind of dynamics, $13 per user, even if they don't convert all of them, that is a reasonable acquisition cost, right?
Yeah.
So even if they hate all the tech and discard everything else, if they can somehow convert a subset of those users into Voodoo users, that is extraordinary customer growth for a dollar figure that is roughly in range with what the going rate is for acquiring customers. Of course, going to be a bunch of overlap and that kind of stuff, but I imagine that's a huge part of it, right? This is an acquisition strategy as far as I can see.
That's a really good point. I can see that, but also I'm still curious because, the whole ad stuff, it's still an issue. I mean, earlier this week, ad blocker Sponsor Block posted that it's Google and video services testing out the server-side ad injection with a limited number of users. Google's reiterated its position that ad blockers violate YouTube's terms of service and that viewers who want an ad-free experience should sign up for YouTube Premium. So I think, I see your point. That's actually a great one. That's kind of cheap to acquire 40 million potential users. But, how will that play out over time remains the bigger question. Will they be able still to, because I was intrigued. BeReal's not making money. So this is a huge bet, and that this can be turned into a way to monetize for Voodoo.
Totally. And this is not at all uncommon either, right? A bunch of the startups I'm working with when I'm not wearing my TC hat are doing acquisitions for users, right? They've built a product. They're struggling to get to a certain user base. And they're like, wait a minute, our struggling competitor that has 10,000 users is like on the chopping block. We can acquire the customer, roll in the user base, and the cost of acquisition is actually cheap for user acquisition. Mm-hmm. And we can go through and cherry pick the best employees and take them too. So it's a pretty well-trodden ground. It's pretty high risk, right? Because who knows if those users are going to be angry about your acquisition or the change or whatever. But it makes business sense. If you're just doing dollars for eyeballs, it makes sense.
Yeah, well, we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's one of the bigger bets I've seen in this space for sure.
A big bet for sure. But anyway, we're going to have to leave it there. But Equity will be back on Monday. Until then, you can find me on X at Bay Area Writer. And Kirsten, where can you be found on the internet?
So many places, Marianne. But in the social media world, at Kirsten Korosek on Threads, Instagram, and X.
And Haya, what about you?
I am mostly on X under @Haya.
Which is spelled Haje, by the way.
That's the one.
You can also find Equity under the handle EquityPod on X and Threads. Don't forget to check out our sister show, Found, which dives deep into the stories behind startups with the founders who built them. Have a great weekend, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Picavet, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.